Hi everyone and welcome to my new video. Today we're going to look at the absolute basics of the UiPath Robotic Enterprise Framework because I think it's a very powerful tool that can help you, especially with large-scale automations. We're going to get to know all the components and we're going to learn how to use it in a project. If you liked the video, then please subscribe to the channel to be notified when I upload a new video. Enjoy learning and happy automation. The ReFramework is a standardized framework by UiPath designed to work very well with transactional processes. And if we're talking about transactional processes, we are talking about processes that process several items that could be documents or bills, or also just information that I pulled from a data table, for example, the same way. And if we are working with transactional processes, it's also very good to work with a dispatcher and a performer process. And in this case, our dispatcher actually populates the queue by uploading items, and the performer gets items from the queue and then processes them in a standardized way. And the Ref framework is especially very suitable for our performer process. This process structure also has several advantages. So the first advantage is that we have a standardized retry mechanism, meaning that if our process fails after having processed maybe half of the items, then we can easily start the performer process again, and we are going to start with the open items, and we don't have to start with the first item again, and we also don't have to run our dispatcher again. The second advantage is that we can process the items in a distributed way, meaning that if we have more than one robot, actually several robots can work on the same queue at the same time. Now, if we look at the Ref framework on the highest level, we can already see that it has 4 phases. And the first phase is called initialization. And what happens in the initialization stage is that our process opens all applications that are being used in the process once. It then initializes all settings required for the process. And finally, it also extracts the values from the config file and stores them in a local dictionary variable where we can access all our constant values. And I'm going to tell you how the config file is structured and how you can work with it later. But for now, it's just important to know that the config file is being extracted in the initialization stage. The second stage is called get transaction data, and what happens in the second stage is basically that our process just picks an item from the queue and then stores it in a local variable where we can work with our transaction item in the next stage. In our process stage, we actually process the item, meaning that this is the core part of our process. And we process the item and then afterwards change the status of the item in the queue to, for example, successful or failed, depending on whether there were any exceptions or not. And in the final stage, the end process stage, our process closes all open applications and then afterwards ends the process. That also means that if our framework works and there are no exceptions in our process, then the initialization stage and the end process stage are occurring just once, and the get transaction data stage and the process transaction stage are occurring several times depending on how many queue items we have. We're going to pick the queue item, process the transaction, pick the next queue item, process the transaction, and keep doing that until there's no more data, and then end our process once. The Ref framework also has some standardized exception handling. First of all, if there's no exception being thrown in the process stage, then we are just going to change the status in the queue to successful, and then continue with the get transaction data stage by picking the next item from the queue. If a business exception is being thrown during the process stage, then the item will be marked as failed in the queue, and UiPath is once again going to continue with get transaction data by picking the next queue item. And last but not least, if a system exception occurs in our process transaction stage, then UiPath is going to close all open application and restart the process with the initialization stage. So this could be helpful maybe if our system or application that we are working with is down or maybe is frozen, for example, then UiPath is just going to close the application or the website and then log in once again. And if the problem doesn't occur anymore, we can keep working in a new environment basically. And last but not least, that's what I told you before already. After all items have been processed, UiPath transfers to the end process stage and the defined actions. If we are creating a new project in UiPath Studio and we want to use the ReFramework, we need to select Robotic Enterprise Framework template here on the right side. And we're going to give it a name and click on create, and we're going to see that UiPath is going to create a new project from the template. And if we open the main workflow, which is our general business process, basically, then we see that it already has the 4 stages: initialization, get transaction data, process transaction, and end process that I've explained before. And if we open the project in our documents, we can also see that UiPath has created the project folder and that we already have a lot of different folders and also sub-processes here. So on the main level, we can see our main process here, which is the general business process that contains the 4 different stages. And here on the framework, we can see that there are already several business processes or several sub-processes that are already included in the Robotic Enterprise Framework. And for some of them, we don't need to change anything at all. For example, set transaction status or retry current transaction. And for some others, we basically need to invoke additional sub-processes in our predefined processes, such as init all applications or close all applications. But I'm going to show that in the practical example. For now, this is how you set up a new project with the ReFramework template. And another thing that's important here is under data, we already have a file which is called config, and this is going to be our config file, and I'm going to explain how it is structured and how we can use it in the next step. If we open the config file, you can see that there are 3 different worksheets, one being called settings, the second being called constants, and the third being called assets. So if you open one of these worksheets, you can also see that there are already several values populated. And some of these values don't need to be changed, and some of the values need to be changed in order to use the ReFramework properly. So on the first page, on the settings page, we are actually going to change the first value, which is orchestrator queue name, and we're going to replace the default value by the name of our queue as it's being used in orchestrator. For the second value, we don't need to change it unless our process is running in a different folder than the queue is located in. So if the queue is located in a different folder than our process, then we need to give the orchestrator folder path here. Otherwise, we can just leave it empty. And for the last value, we can basically leave it as it is as well. In the second worksheet, constants, you can see that there are already a lot of values, but most of them, those are the ones that you can see here, are basically just constant parts of log messages. So this is going to be used for logging, and we don't actually need to change it because this is the standard logging used in the ReFramework. It's going to give you the process transaction number and give you some standardized log messages such as the transaction was successful or some exception appeared and all that kind of stuff. So the ones we can change here are the second and the second and third row. These values define the maximum retry number and maximum consecutive system exceptions. That means if we change the maximum retry number, we're going to change the number of retries on a specific transaction items if it runs into a system exception. So if we set this to 2, for example, then if one of our transaction item fails with a system exception, the process is going to retry it 2 times before setting the status to failed and continuing with the next transaction item. And for this value in row 3, actually we can leave both of them as they are. But if we want to change it, then we are basically changing the, as the name says, maximum number of consecutive system exceptions that can occur before UiPath actually ends the process. So right now there's no such mechanism, but if we set it to 2 and our process fails with a system exception, UiPath is going to close all applications, start with the initialization stage, try again, run into another system exception, and then do that 2 times before actually stopping the process. And for the rest of the values, we're not going to touch them as already mentioned. In our assets worksheet, we can store assets that we have in Orchestrator. So if we do that, we just have to give the name of the asset here, and then the ReFramework is automatically going to retrieve all assets defined here from Orchestrator in the initialization stage and add them to a dictionary from where we can use them. Now, if we have any additional constants that we want to store in our dictionary, we can basically do that in the settings page. So it doesn't really matter. Let's say we have a specific web application that needs to be started. Then we could, for example, store the URL here, and it's going to be webapp.com. Maybe we have a specific mail recipient that's going to receive our progress mail or going to receive a mail in the process phase. Then we can also define the recipient here, for example. So that would be my name. But we could actually use any kind of value here. So maybe if we are working with files and they are stored in a specific folder, then we could include source folder here or target folder if we move the processed files to another folder. And then here we would just give, let's say, this part. And yeah, that's how we store our values here. What's important to know is that the ReFramework is going to extract all these values and then add them to a dictionary of type string object. So in our dictionary, the first column, which is called name here, will be our key, and the second column will be the value in the dictionary. So I'm going to show you that in practice in a second, but it's just very important to understand the structure here. Now, if we look at the ReFramework in UiPath Studio, then as I already mentioned, here in initialization stage and under init all settings, the ReFramework is going to extract the values from the config file without the need to change anything for us here. And what it's going to do is it's going to define a variable here and initialize the dictionary And then for each sheet that we have in the config file, meaning that you could also just add additional sheets, it's going to extract the values and add them to the same dictionary, which is being called config, or here on this level it's called outConfig. And the variable will then be passed to the highest level of our process, which is general business process. So on this level, at least, we are always going to have the dictionary around. And the advantage of that is that if we have, as I already mentioned, a folder path that is being used at different parts or different stages of the process, and we are storing the folder path in our config file, and the folder path changes, then we need to only change the path here. And we are just going to work with the values from the config file in our project. So there's no need to basically find the activities that are working with the folder path in our project and change the path under properties. So I'm going to set a breakpoint here before getting the transaction data, because we currently do not have any items in the queue, and the queue as defined in the config file doesn't even exist actually. But I just want to show you something, and that is that when I run the file, you're going to see that, let's close it. You're going to see that UiPath here is going to ignore. UiPath is going to extract the values and store them here in our config variable. And as you can see here, there are 20 values, and the structure is, as mentioned before, our key, and here our value. And if we now want to work with any of these values, I'm just going to explain it real quick, because I might do another video on working with dictionary variables. Then we can basically call them by referring to our config, giving the key, I think it was mail recipient, and then adding toString here, because our dictionary is of type string object. And if we run this again and ignore this, you're going to see that we can immediately work with the values in the config file. And another thing that is worth mentioning is, as I already mentioned before, we're going to have the config file here on our general business process level. But if we are going, or if we are invoking sub-processes here, we are not going to automatically have the config available. So for example, the process XAML here is already predefined, but as you can see, it needs to import the config file. So in our process stage, which is where we are going to work with the config values the most, we are not using the variable config, because there is no such variable on this level, but we're going to use the argument in config here. Yeah, and that is basically how you work with the config file and use the values in your process. In the demo, I just want to give a brief overview about the ReFramework and show you the most important sub-processes and how to work with them. So we're going to go through the framework step by step. In the initialization phase, actually, you don't need to change anything at the first part here. But here in kill all processes, you can invoke or you can add any kill process activities if you want to refresh the environment that you're working in. So let's say we are working with Excel files, or we are working with any web pages in Chrome, then we might actually want to, I think it's Chrome, the process name, then we might actually want to kill all these processes in active sessions before we start our process. Because then we make sure that there are no interfering sessions whatsoever. So whatever applications you use here, whatever processes you use here, it makes sense to kill them before starting your process. So that's what you can add here under kill all processes. And then here at the end, under init all applications, you're going to invoke all your sub-processes that start any of the applications. So let's say you have one sequence to start and log into an application. It would be web app login or something like that. Then, as done before, you're just going to invoke your process right here, and yeah, do the same for all other applications that you're going to use in the process. And if you've done that, basically that's all you need to do in the initialization stage. We're going to the next stage, get transaction data. You actually don't need to change anything here. What it's going to do is basically grab the queue item from the queue and then store it in a local variable so that you can use it within, for example, the process stage. There's no need to change anything here. Just one thing I want to show you. Get transaction data has an out argument here with the transaction item, and the transaction item is of type queue item and is going to be stored in a local variable called transaction item here. So if you want to work with any information or something stored in the transaction item, then you can basically use it and call it from the local variable. On our process stage, there's also on this level nothing that we have to change unless you want to add custom exception handling or something like that. But we have the process workflow here, and that's actually another level deeper. And in our process workflow, we're going to add all sub-processes that process the transaction. So let's say we have an Excel file and we want to format it, for example. Then we would have a sequence here called Excel format sheet, for example. And in our process stage, we are just going to invoke our sub-process here. And we're going to do that for all other sub-processes that are needed to process our transaction item. And one other thing, as I mentioned before, the config variable on this level is being called inConfig because it's an argument. And we also already have the transaction item here in our inTransaction item argument. So as I mentioned before, let's say you have a queue item that contains the path to the Excel file that we want to format here. And you have, I don't know, 50 queue items and with 50 different paths. And then you could basically call the information from the queue item in this way. Let's say it would be in Excel path. So on this level, we could actually call any information from the queue item by using in transaction item, specific content, whatever the key is in the queue item, Excel path, and use toString because it's once again an object, I think. So that would be our process stage. And then for the last stage, end process, there's just one subflow here, which is called close all applications. And here we are going to invoke all sub-processes that are needed to close any of the open applications. So let's say we have the login in our initialization, then we would have the web app logout sub-process here, and just as done before, invoke it here by drag and drop or by using invoke workflow. And those are basically the minimal things or the minimum things you need to do in order to use the ReFramework. And I hope you liked the video and you learned something, and see you next time.